Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and here with me is my co-author, my co-host, my best buddy in the whole world, that creepy creature that goes bump in the night.
Trent Hergenrader.
Hear him beeping? Beeping, bumping. You hear him bumping?
I'm beeping in the night too. That's my
Can't speak.
CPAP
Okay. Beep. Thank you, everyone, for joining the second in our three-part series in which we two world builders are guiding you through a real-life, genuine world-building workshop using the world-building card deck to construct a shiny, new story world from scratch. So you might recall, if you tuned in for part one, we described the 4 structures, the 14 substructures, and a bunch of example story worlds that mapped to the numerical values we were dealing out. We talked through how our substructures might intersect with one another and debated what the trending versus stable categories might mean for different kinds of people or groups. Today, for part 2, we're going to add some texture to our world by defining its scope and sequence, as well as its breadth and depth, its genre, maybe some other things, some different categories, events, places, things like that. With a little bit of elbow grease and a little bit of hard work, which I don't think either of us is afraid of, we should have a strong foundation for part 3 in which the two of us are going to use Trent's character building system to generate a diverse group of people whose life worlds can serve as a lens to evaluate the world's social forces. So as a quick review, our substructural breakdown, the values that we dealt out along with the card deck, our government presence was at a high with 5. That one was trending. We had rule of law at a 3, social services at a 4, economic strength was a 2 trending, agriculture and trade was a 4. Wealth distribution was a 3 and trending. Then in our social category, we had race relations at a 3, class relations at a 5, gender relations at a 3, and sexual orientation relations at a 4. And finally, in our cultural influences category, religion was at a 1, military influence was at a 2, technology influence was at a 2 trending, and arts and culture influence was at a 1. We ran through a bunch of, as I said, we ran through a bunch of different examples previously that we thought mapped to this. Some added bonus ones that we didn't actually talk about but have occurred to me since we recorded include the Hunger Games and THX 1138, although I'm sure we'll come up with more as we discuss. Trent, can you give a short explainer on how to prime learners for this process and or share some Cliff's notes on maintaining a well-oiled world-building machine as this whole thing unfolds?
Yeah, I would say, especially at this earliest stage, just making sure that all ideas are being listened to, right? There's not, the best idea isn't necessarily going to, win out or anything. So just let everyone have their say and don't rush it either. I think it's just like there's often really fun stuff that comes up out of the blue, right? Somebody comes, oh, I just saw something new, with new eyes or whatever. But what I like to look at when we're starting off too is looking at those 5s and the 1s. So you've got the government presence is a 5 and class equality is a 5. And then the 1s are religion and arts and culture, and figure out, okay, so this seems like sort of a authoritarian kind of state, in some sense. Doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of fun here. But the question that I like to ask or pose to them is, who would it be awesome to be in this world? Like, if you could be anybody in this world, who would be the best person to be? And who would be the absolute worst person to be? Like, who would have the worst kind of things working against them? And in this particular case, I'd think, oh, well, if you're part of the government system and you are up near the top echelon of the government, that seems like a pretty good place to be. And if you are an artist rabble rouser, it seems like that's a terrible place to be in this world, right? So, and then just thinking about, okay, well, what are all of the things sort of in between? I also like to think, with the trending, that we've got the government presence, economic strength, wealth distribution, and technology that are all trending. And there are going to be some people who want to prevent it from trending either up or down, right? So it's like, thinking about how different people within this particular world would want to see the future happen differently or have a different result in the future. So like this is one of the things when we talk about the sequence, I always bring this up in my classes. We got Star Wars where it starts and it's like, oh, it's the beginning of the Galactic Civil War, and Lord of the Rings, it's the beginning of the end of the Third Age, right? So these are worlds that are in flux, in transition. The reason why that's great to have a world in flux is because you have people who can can line up on both sides. The people who want the change to hurry up and come, you can have the people who want the change to stop, right? And it can be either way. Like we're going to have the people who are like, no, we should have robot overlords, and the plucky rebels who say no. And on the other hand, it's like, oh well, we're going to increase equality and all these things, and then you have the people in power who say, well, no, you're not, right? So being able to find within societies reasonable people, or whatever people from either side of these debates, I think is always really, really useful, because it makes us realize that there are no objective right or wrong answers. And it's like, well, there could be somebody who wants this world because they're selfish or whatever, right? But just thinking about who would be wanting to see these things change, in what ways, I always think that's sort of a good way of thinking about it. And as we talked about last time, we've got all of these trending categories. And my thought would be, for this particular set, either they should all be trending up or they should all be trending down, because either way, those are going to cause stability. That's going to cause instability in a previously stable environment. It's kind of what I think the key is here. Because sometimes you can say, oh, well, this is going up and that's going to push this down, right? I think in this case, either having the government, the economic strength, the wealth distribution, and the technology either all going up or all going down. I suppose wealth distribution could be one that would be going down while the others were going up too. That would be one in which that would also cause strain and stress. But this is something that I always say too, like in my role-playing game campaigns, whenever I'm the DM, whenever I'm doing this in class, like you want to make the world difficult. You want to make things, I always talk about throwing sparks. You want to have clashes. You want to have people with differences of opinions. And it doesn't necessarily need to be violent, but it does need to have tensions that you can exploit and then put people in the middle of it, right? Like, mom says this, dad says that. What does the child say, right? That kind of, you don't want the good guys clearly on one side and the bad guys clearly on the other, because that's not really the way our world works either. So, trying to get into that kind of nuance, I think is important. The last thing I would say too is like having, like in a case, we've talked a lot over the last bunch of episodes about making generalizations about groups of people. And I always warn them to not have like the scapegoat, right? There's the bad people who are coming in and they're going to, do this and they're evil. And it's like, well, maybe if they're demons from another dimension who feed on human flesh, like, maybe we don't need to explore their softer side all that much, right? It's okay for them to be the evil. But for the most part, you don't want like another, race or religion or whatever to be the one where it's like, oh, well, they're the bad guys. And they're almost always, when you've got that kind of binary, the bad guys are a monoculture, right? Like they're all the same way and whatever. And this is, one of the things that I think Tolkien gets blamed for, slammed for. And I don't know. He wanted orcs to all be irredeemably bad. That was just what he wanted. I don't think he wanted anybody to say, oh, well, all people from Wisconsin are like orcs, right? Which is unfortunately what we're seeing today is you pick teams and then make the other team the bad guy. And I think that's one of the things that I like to bring to people's attention, bring to students' attention as we're working on this, that's not the point. It's more, why would reasonable people, or why would people who have motivations find themselves in these kinds of clash of cultures?
I do think the incentive structures of the world are really interesting and valuable to interrogate. And you're not going to find that if you don't look at the intersections between the substructures. Like if you just pick the median person in the world and their life is fine, I don't think that makes for a particularly compelling story.
Right.
Nor do I find it to be particularly instructionally useful. And so just as a precursor to our discussion about this, I know I had said in previous episodes that one of the ways that I approach creative production is through the lens of who am I trying to communicate to and what do I want them to understand about this world. So if that's the case for this world, and I'm approaching this as an educator who's thinking about, I need to teach some learning objective, well, then the goal here becomes alignment of your learning objective with whatever it is you have the students doing in this world. So any activity, any character you have them follow, any story you have them tell, you're probably going to shepherd them toward some specific thing. But if it's a project where they're all just creating something themselves, you might tell them, think about what you want your audience to get out of this experience, reading about, playing, whatever it is that they're creating, whether it's a book or a board game, whatever. I wanted to add too that in terms of strategy for keeping this thing well-oiled and functional as you're going through it, I always told my students to adopt the improv adage of yes and, not no but, because you're never going to benefit from telling people they're shut out of the process. Like, let every opinion get dropped on the table. There's no bad ideas in a brainstorm. We don't have to keep every single one of them. And honestly, a big side component of this, or a big side benefit of this, is that you're teaching people how to share. Like
Yeah.
I know that sounds really stupid, but
Straight back to preschool. Yeah.
we're straight back to preschool, but that's kind of the point of collaborative writing is you got to give a little to get a little. You can't, and you don't want it to be all one person's thing. Like you had said previously, you don't want one person's world to then engulf everybody else who's participating in this. You want them to feel ownership of this process too. So it really is, and I know it probably sounds silly that you would need to teach college students this or teach people in a professional development seminar about this, but like people are people and they get married to their ideas and they do need to learn to relinquish a little bit in order to compromise. So we are trying to model that when we go through this process with our learners, especially toward the beginning of it. It gets a little bit different as you get further along in the process. You do have to hold people accountable to the world they've created. So if they start veering off the path in some wild way, you might need to rein them back in and say, well, wait a minute, you all kind of agreed this is how the world works. This is how these kinds of relations are. This is what the government is or whatever. You can't suddenly flip that on its head 3/4 of the way through the project, or at least not if you don't have some democratic agreement by everybody in the group.
Yeah.
So it will modulate as you go along, but at the very beginning, especially, you want people to adopt that yes and perspective because, I mean, as you noted before, like we don't have all the information. None of us do. So if you want to get some interesting examples, you want to get some interesting artists you never heard of, you want to get some short story you never read, all of that's going to come from the group as a whole. It's not going to come from any one person's experiential background. And I think that ends up being a super important component here. I should preface our discussion of the world we're creating by saying it's just the two of us. So in a normal situation, normal in quotes, when you're doing this with a group of learners, when you're doing this in a workshop setting, you're going to have groups of 4 people or maybe even more than that, depending on the nature of the environment. So you're probably going to get a lot more options put on the table. Trent and I are going to be limited by our own body of knowledge about other works of fiction, other places in the world, other ways of thinking. So there might be times where you get a much greater diversity of opinion, and that's good. Like we're not suggesting you have to have our beliefs or use our specific framework. And that is, as I noted at the end of the last episode, one of the things I'd love to hear from other people about is when you hear the values that we dealt out, do you have examples that come to mind that we didn't think of? Because I don't know. I don't know what you know. So please, by all means, share with us if you think we're missing something or you think there's an opportunity here, because I'd love to come back and revisit this at some point, or maybe we have another episode where we do this with a group of people to sort of showcase what happens when you have a greater breadth of opinions or a greater breadth of background knowledge that can contribute to the broader project.
Yeah. I would say too, just that one of the things that I think is maybe implicit that I want to make explicit is all of these categories that we're talking about between governance, economics, social relations or equality, and then cultural influences. They're all, well, I'll use the term human, right? These are all things that are made by people. This is not something that exists out in nature, right? There aren't animals who are organizing themselves this way. So when we've got something like, oh, well, why can't women vote? Well, it's because somebody made a law that didn't give them the right to vote, right? It was like it excluded them. So this is where when you're looking at how one of the things that I think we probably talked about, yeah, I know we talked about it in one of the earlier episodes, to change any one of these or to threaten any one of these, it doesn't just affect the other things that are in that structure. It affects the whole thing, right? And that's where we see this today. And I mean, this is one of the things that I would, not to get off track, but like in our own political process in the United States in the 21st century, people don't want to do what I would suggest would be sort of the morally or ethically correct thing, because it's going to have a ripple effect that's going to change something down the road that they don't want to have changed, right? So people seem to be working against their own interests when they're trying to actually say, well, you know what, this may look good in the short term, but long term, this is going to cost me down the road. And I think, again, Steve, you said this before, I think you said it best, you want your students to be asking better questions, right? And this is where what we don't want to try and drive at is a correct view of understanding a world or the world or whatever it is, but sort of understanding that all of these collisions of ideas is what we are going through every single day, right? Through every interaction, like just different people's perspectives of what is right, what is wrong, what is fair, what is unfair, where they're positioned, where other people are positioned. We're going through those interactions, even when you're just going to the grocery store and checking out, right? Like those are things that we've all sort of built in our mind about how the world works. But yeah, so anyway, that's that. I just wanted to throw that in there as well. That these are, a government needs to decide how the economy is, or will have a huge say in how the economy works. They'll have a huge say in how equality is enforced or not enforced, right? They will have a
Hmm.
huge say in whether the military gets funding or whether religious institutions are exempt or benefited from, you know what I mean, whatever it is. So, and then it's the same thing that the economics are going to determine how powerful the government might be, right? And you just
Hmm.
keep running through all of this stuff where it's like, yeah, it's all connected. And I think I may have said this in an earlier show, but I had a student once who said, "Oh, I now understand like these one of these epiphanies. Now I understand why social change is so hard because you may think that you're just trying to change gender relations, but
Hmm.
that's tied to the government and that's tied to the economy and that's tied to our cultural whatever. So it's not you're not just trying to find this one isolated thing that you're going to take care of. You got to think about how it's going to impact the entire system if we move any of them in any direction. How that's going to ripple throughout the entire and maybe for permanent change, right? It may be forever changed, and that's a scary thing for people.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a an analogy that comes to me because I used to teach biology or if it's genuinely useful to anybody, but the food web is very similar to the way that we think about this
Yeah,
system that we're talking about using to describe the world, right? In the context of the food web, you think about the producers that take sunlight and they turn that into energy that can be consumed by primary consumers that are then consumed by secondary consumers and tertiary consumers. All of those things create this sort of effect where there can only be so many tertiary consumers based on how much energy is getting converted into the food chain for all these other things to eat. That's kind of similar to what's happening here. Like if you affect one part of this system, the whole system is going to feel the ripples of that thing that happens. The same way that if you take a forest and you clear cut it, that's going to change the dynamics of the food sources for all the things that lived in that forest, right? Not only are they going to have
absolutely.
fewer places to live, or flooding might become an issue, or all these different things, it's going to cause this sort of paradigm shift in the way that specific area of land actually changes over time. And I think the same thing is true here. Like if you take a 5 in government presence and you topple a very strong government and it becomes anarchy, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that your society is going to function like it was before you toppled the government, right? You're likely
Hmm.
going to have all of these downstream consequences that will be negative for the people in that society. It may be positive in some sense, but you're also creating unrest or you're creating economic inequality or all of these different things that are ultimately going to redound to the benefit of some people and the detriment of other people. We just want to be able to help our learners ask questions about what are happening at those points of intersection between all the substructures, and then using those individuals that you kind of drop in there as characters, look at how they bounce around like a marble or a pinball inside a pinball machine off of all of these systems, and then follow them along to see who comes out on top and who doesn't and why.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think I was, as you were talking, I'm like, gee, I wonder if there's any current events that may that may line up. But we'll not touch that third rail right now. But let's start talking about building out this world. Which do you have a strong feeling as to whether these are all going up or going down? Because I mean, what I would say is one of the things that I'm intrigued with, and I could easily be talked out about it, is that this is like a terraforming project, right? Where they go to, this is somebody who's way out in the middle of nowhere, and the project is starting to wind down, but some people don't want it to wind down, right? Like it's actually pretty good, and like we don't want to leave just because our time has run its place or whatever. We run out of government funding or whatever. And just thinking about okay, well, the economics are going to go away, and then that's going to make the wealth distribution difficult, right? Maybe there's going to be outside technology that's coming in. You're going to get airlifted stuff that's going to allow you to leave, and then the government is going to break up, right? And I could totally see that if you were in a great position in the government, that you wouldn't want to leave, right? Like you're like, oh, I got to go home and then be, a shoeshine kid or something like that. Like I wanted to stay this way, but I could also see how this otherwise, hippie commune or anything like that strikes oil, and then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, like we're gonna get rich, and then you've got the people who are like, we got to take advantage of this, and the people who are like, no, dude, like we should just keep doing our hippie commune thing. So I could go either way on that. And do you have any sense of, like, do you have any strong genre senses either?
Yeah, I thought maybe it would be helpful just to give the audience some idea of when I would do this with my students, I would give them a list of different genres, some of which they absolutely had heard of before and some of which they probably hadn't. For instance, solar punk might be one that people hadn't heard of before because you don't see a ton of it, although I find it very interesting, the idea of sort of over reclaimed wildlife sanctuaries, et cetera, that have been built with technology to be able to create this sort of utopian reality where the sun is powering everything and everybody lives in harmony. I often would point them at sort of alternate reality where there are superheroes that are embedded in society, something like Invincible, maybe like the Amazon Prime and the comic book series Invincible.
Or the
I would
boys
also
being
the boys being another version of that,
yeah,
absolutely, or the Marvel Cinematic Universe or whatever,
right.
which I think is probably the one that most of them would default to familiarization with. And then I would also point to things like steampunk or gothic horror, or I mean, horror is an interesting one, which I don't know if I've ever built a world that actually circled around a horror theme, but that could be kind of interesting. A Vaesen or Nordic
Hmm.
horror style, a mid 19th century Northern American kind of gothic. I don't
Sure.
know. There's something playing around with that in my head a little bit. And then there's the genre, I guess, that kind of popped out at me as I was thinking about this is I think you could justifiably say this is a similar setup to Monsters Inc., the Pixar movie, where like government presence is not the government per se, but it is the governance of the Scream collection corporation,
Yep.
right? Where you have Water News as sort of the boss, and then the technology influence trending upward would be the discovery that children's laughter was actually more valuable than their screams were, which destabilizes the governance because Water News doesn't want it to change, right? So maybe something along those lines, or similarly, A Bug's Life. I think you could
Right.
make a
That
good argument here. So like, I'm
always
kind of all over the place right now.
always the high culture with you, Steve. So
I know that's what I'm here for, and I'm
I was
sure there are some really interesting anime examples here too. Yeah, could you
Shakespeare and Dante. But if you wanted to go with Pixar, that's totally. I mean, equally
give the people what they
give the
want,
people
Trent.
what they
Give the
want. Yeah.
people what they want. So yeah, in terms of genre, I'm kind of like all over the place. Like I said in the previous episode, I think Western would be an interesting genre here. Like you said, I mean, that kind of blends with the Old West.
Yep.
Let's, take the oil and run or use it and whatever, a gold rush, something along those lines. There was another thought I had had too in between recording these episodes. What if we did something like Coen Brothers-y? Something like this
Hmm.
feels like you could come up with a pretty good Coen Brothers style story here, something like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, right?
Hmm.
Or, any number of their other movies, No Country for Old Men, I think it fits in that Western genre
Yep.
style. So I don't know. What are you thinking based off of some of those ideas? Or
Yeah.
do
What
you think, I mean, I'm not opposed to the idea of doing the terraforming thing either. I think that's interesting. I just didn't know if you wanted to point in a non-science fiction-y direction.
No, that's totally. Science fiction is. I tend to write and enjoy dark fantasy the most of genre fiction. So if we want to go that direction, I would love to. I'm thinking, looking at the low cultural influences, to me, that suggests everything about this suggests to me a community that is withdrawn from a majority population, right? So this could
Hmm.
be either a colony or westward expansion, or whatever direction expansion we want in this particular world, where the group that is there has had a very solid sort of understanding of why they're together, how they're together, and what they're trying to do. And
Hmm.
now it seems to me that with some of these changes with the trending values, that's where this is now ruptured, right? Whether it was planned or whether it was not planned, either the technology is going from a 2 to a 1, or it's going from a 2 to a 3, meaning either they can get less or they can get more out of their environment. And I think that would be I always think too, one of the things that I like to look at, both literally and then sort of metaphorically, is the age of like how long a society has been around, and then also the
Hmm.
age of the people who are in it, because young people tend to want to see more change, they want to be
Hmm.
more daring, they want to be more adventurous, right? And you could also sort of make that claim that a society that has been stable for lots and lots and lots of years would be less likely to make dramatic changes than one that is still sort of new, still sort of finding its feet. So I think that's where I like the idea that they came from some other culture, some other population center, and now they've been on their own. I don't quite know how long, but I like that idea of almost the environment being problematic, right? Being dangerous, or scarcity, or something is out there. And that's one of the things that's in balance in this world is, do we risk it and do we break what we have, and go out and try and get more? Or do we just kind of hunker down and do everything that we know, even though signs point that we can't do that for much longer?
As you were talking, one of the things that occurred to me was the Spanish conquistadors. Like there's
Hmm.
something in here about that. Like I can, or, like you said, it could just be colonization more broadly or imperialism. I could kind of see, although I struggle with the imperialism part because there's no military influence really.
Right,
So
right,
you're not really going to be imposing something on, at least you wouldn't anticipate resistance, right? Like you're
right.
not anticipating violent resistance most likely. And because there's no religious influence, I don't think you could make the argument that like they're not seeking some religious treasure, they're not seeking some artifact. They're probably quite indifferent to those kinds of things, which does make me think that this society would probably be more science fiction oriented, although I guess it wouldn't necessarily need to be. I'm trying to imagine what would a society be like if it had a high focus on stabilizing the government and economy, but didn't have the kinds of myths or legends that would come along with being a religious society, which normally
Right.
you would associate with being a more technologically advanced society because religion as a technology is meant to fill some of those gaps about meaning, right? So
Yeah.
I'm assuming that the folks in this specific society, civilization, community, whatever, that they probably aren't seeking meaning. It literally is coming down to the economics of
Yep.
this thing. And it actually reminds me a little bit of there's an HBO series, animated series called Scavenger's Reign. The short version is you have a bunch of scientists who land on a planet that has this completely foreign flora and fauna. It ends up consuming one of the people who's there through mind control. And then ultimately the humans end up at each other's throats because they're trying to survive in the wilderness with all these competing incentives, some of them being driven by the environment, some of them being, I just want to escape and get home safely. So that one kind of stands out. It's just sort of
Yeah,
an
no, that's
aesthetic I would drape over this that I think
yeah.
could make some sense.
And maybe it's just because I watched Ballad of Buster Scruggs for the third time the other night, but I'm thinking too, like this West, like if you were doing you are the imperialist power sort of moving,
Hmm.
right? And it's like, oh well, yeah, the closest fort is a day's ride away, but that's the
Hmm.
military. Is the military present? It is, but it's not going to be present when you need it to be, right? If you're so it's like
Hmm.
kind of holding out on your own. And then all that idea too of like, okay, well, if we're going to create this sort of intentional community, then you need to have some strict. I love the show Deadwood too from years ago
Hmm.
on HBO, and I wouldn't say that was the government presence certainly wouldn't be a five, but you could see if some company or if this was like a government funded thing that you've got a mandate, right? Like you're going to go
Hmm.
here, you're going to do this thing for a certain period of time, and then you're all going to come back, right? And that's what I kind of am seeing, where it's like, are we all like now that we've got our orders to break everything down and haul it back home, quote unquote? If they've been there for 30 years, is home even home anymore, right? Or is this
Hmm.
now their home? And they're going to say no, right? We're not going to do that. So that's what I kind of have lodged in my head, but I don't know if that does anything for you.
I like that. I think now that you're talking about it that way, the first thing that comes to mind is the Wayland Corporation
Yeah.
and the Alien movies. You know what I
Yep.
mean? Like
Yep.
it's a little bit off because it's not a perfect fit because government presence isn't really what's driving that. It's almost entirely corporate.
Corporate.
Although at that point it is a corporatist society, so I don't know that there really would be a
Right.
difference. I
Right.
mean,
Right.
it's essentially just the end state of capitalism where you have a few people who sort of rule as the oligarchs, and
Yep.
so I think you could justifiably say it's similar if not the same. And again, it's not a perfect fit, but I can imagine this being sort of at the beginning of that story
Yep.
before Alien takes place, before that they have Alien Earth, I think, has actually done a pretty good job of highlighting this. For all the flaws of that TV show, I actually think it does a pretty good job of setting up the dominoes to fall to create the rest of what happens in that story world. So I think technology influence in this case might not be a tool. It might be an alien species is discovered that has some bioweapon value, or it could be
Hmm.
used to, deploy to create some kind of economic value. I don't know what that might be, but maybe it's the discovery of bison, and they suddenly change the economics of this place because you found this cheap, widely available food source that can now be
Right.
distributed elsewhere where it might be more scarce. So,
Yeah, that's another thing. I mean, this is where too, like, you can keep iterating on different kinds of ideas, but that's the same. Could also be we were dispatched to this. And I'm trying to think. I've got something on the tip of my tongue, but it's like, oh, we were sent here to do this project. Maybe it was The Martian, right? But then like things have gone
mhm,
very wrong, and now we got to
mhm,
try and figure out what do we do? Do we turn around, pack up, and go home, or do we stick it out? And I think with all of
Hmm.
these kinds of examples that we're coming up with, you could see how people would be lining up on both sides of those debates, which is
Hmm.
what makes rich storytelling, that kind of conflict where you could say, I can see where you're coming from. Like I could see why you'd want
Hmm.
to stick it out and stay, or I could see why you would want to pack up and go home, right? And then you can like
Hmm.
that's where and just thinking about where people fit within the society. Like if this is something like talking before about if your best bet is you are the child of somebody who is running this place in the government. You're like, we got to stick it out because I'm the VP. You know what I mean? I'm the
Hmm.
president elect or whatever. Whereas if you're the janitor, you're like, why don't we turn around and go home, right? You know what I mean? It's all the same to me, whether we're out here or whether we're there, and it's safer
Hmm.
home. So like, let's go back. So thinking about where different individual characters would fit within a society, and why people would be able to see from both sides of the perspective. And I mean, this is where too. I always say like we're going around and around. We can flip a coin, we can roll a dice to say whether this is going up or down, or do you want to just pick one?
Well, let's start with scope and sequence because I think at least to me, I think the thing we agree on is the scope is pretty narrow. It's a
Yep.
small group of people. It's
Small
not
group of
going to
people. Yep.
be a large, sprawling civilization. We're talking about a community with a pretty well-defined hierarchy of people in it, whatever that hierarchy ends up being. But it's not going to be a city, right? It's going
Yeah.
to be a relatively small adventuring party, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
In terms of sequence, I'm thinking this is probably on the scale, in at least using our parlance
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
temporal concerns, that it's probably on the scale of weeks or months, not decades, right? That
Hmm.
we're talking about a relatively narrow amount of time where maybe you get some factionalization over this issue that's causing the change, but it's probably not one giant black swan event that immediately changes everything for everybody all at once, but instead something that's sort of a shortish gradual timeline where this thing has happened and now over the course of a couple of weeks or a couple of months we have to make a decision about what
Yeah.
we're going to do, and maybe the inflection point we're arriving at is we now have to choose
We now have to
which
choose
direction we're going to
exactly.
go, right?
Exactly.
So I think that's pretty useful as a framework here.
So how many people are we talking? You think hundreds or 1,000 or
I was thinking maybe even fewer than a dozen, right? Like it
okay.
really depends. I'm not married to any one kind of side. I suppose it would be helpful to have enough that we can kind of get a diversity of characters. So
Right, right.
let's say at least hundreds,
Okay.
maybe a
Yeah, yeah.
thousand.
All right. Yeah.
I think especially if we're going to talk about like westward expansion, or it did occur to me like the whole Manifest Destiny Lewis and Clark thing could even be kind of a model for this, where we
Yeah.
had these people sent out that maybe are a scouting party, or maybe they're looking for something for the larger civilization, but they're still removed from that civilization and maybe don't have a way to communicate back to them.
That's what I was
So
thinking is isolation is also part. I'm thinking with having those cultural influences being so far removed that speaks to me as being an isolated thing, right? Like it doesn't matter what the
mhm.
people back home do. But yeah, I like that. I like that idea. And I like that idea of it being like maybe the conditions changed, right? They had a scouting report and it turns out there's something different than what the scouting report said.
Mm.
And now it's like, okay, well, are we going to stick to the plan or are we going to come up with something new or whatever? And yeah, you could see that you wouldn't need a whole lot of people to start having differences of opinions right off the bat. And if it's government, I mean, it's like you were saying, if it were like the Wayland Corporation in Aliens, then or in the Alien franchise, it's like it's basically indistinguishable between the government, right? So
Right.
it's like who's ever in charge or whoever the 10 people who are in charge, they have the rank in order to be able to say this is what we're doing, but then they don't have the jail and all of the apparatus
Mhm.
of the justice system behind them. So it exists, but it's kind of toothless, right?
I like that because it explains the rule of law being a three, right? Like these people only have enough authority to enforce the rules as the trust they have in the other people who are with them,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
There's no system that's going to come and support them here. It also kind of explains the economic strength piece because if you're a group that's scouting or colonizing or whatever, you're not going to have a robust economy with you. You're going to be, here are our supplies and that's what we have available to us to stay
Subsistence,
alive,
yeah.
your rations, your whatever. we haven't talked yet about the class and sexual orientation relations or equality piece of this, and I'm wondering if maybe that's a break point within the group, like that the class is not necessarily economic class, but maybe class in terms of the government structure, right?
That's yeah, right.
You had mentioned previously the notion that a caste system could kind of fit into that bucket. Maybe there's kind of a caste system within this group of hundreds or 1,000 people, and those that they could be based on their jobs, right? Or
Right.
even like in Star Trek, you have the various roles that different people have. So if you're not the captain and you're the janitor, you're part of different classes within the broader
Right.
world of
Right.
Star Trek. So
And that could very easily, I was thinking that same thing, that if you're the custodial staff, that in this system, maybe you have just as much say as somebody who is on the scientific team. And I could see how that would be like, oh, well, if class is really that equal, but you could see how people would have attitude about that, right? Like, why did they get to be, I know we're supposed to be treating them equal, but we're not equal in all of these other ways. So when it comes to making a decision, why would it be one person, one vote? Shouldn't it be the smartest get to make the choice?
well, and then you get the interesting incentive structure component of if everybody's vote is equal, how are you going to vie to improve your own position with that within that group? Sort of like, not that this is quite the same thing, but a reality TV show, right? Like that
Yeah.
you have
Yeah.
all these people who ostensibly are equal in the context of that competition.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
if you're doing Survivor, your job is to survive. And so you're going to leverage your social relationships as best as possible to be able to build up your own power, your own wealth, accrue all of those things that are ultimately going to situate you to be a stronger leader down the road.
Yeah.
And again, if we're talking about a situation in which there's no external enforcement of rule of law and it just kind of is what it is, you make the best of whatever you have. Maybe this is a Lord of the Flies situation, like that we have people who are vying for power to lead the group. There is no arbiter of justice within this group. It just kind of is people holding each other accountable. Everybody's resources are largely the same in terms of social services, right? Social services, if we're thinking about it in terms of education, healthcare, et cetera,
Yeah.
it's going to be pretty equitable because there aren't a ton of people and also there's not that many resources to
Yep.
distribute.
Very
But
bureaucratic, right? Very
yeah,
bureaucratic.
yeah.
We're going to make sure that everyone has the same, portions and all those kind of things. So that's where it also reminds me of like early Soviet Union or something like that, right? Where it's like, at least in letter, they were saying that it was going to be, we were going to have class solidarity or whatever.
Do you think that means that we agree on trending up or down? Because I
It could
think
still go either
yeah,
way.
it could still be either, right? I'm
I
inclined to say I like the idea of technology influence increasing. I think
okay.
that trending upward and becoming a more influential component of this group of people, this society, is probably the most interesting one. But then we have to figure out, okay, I do think that would create greater wealth stratification. So
Right.
wealth distribution is going to become less equal as this goes on, and you have people vying for position. Economic strength is also, I think, there's a focal point of what we're fighting about is going to be really useful. So the technology, whether it's biological or technological, I think is ultimately going to be the thing that causes the economy of this place to trend
Yep.
probably upward. And then the government presence piece, I could see that going either way because the people at the top are probably going to clamp down and try to create a more totalitarian
That's what I
situation.
was thinking too. Yeah. So like when looking at this too, that if you all have your own roles and everybody, doesn't matter where you are in terms of the importance of your job, if everyone has got the same allotment, right? And that's super important to everybody and that's what they want to keep equal. But it
Mhm.
turns out that the scientific class or the explorer class is now being able to take advantage of this technology, right? Because the class system isn't trending. So then that could
Mhm.
be something where it's like, this is going to snap in half, right? There's no way that you can have a small group of people benefiting where we can't redistribute evenly,
Mhm.
whatever benefit they have. And that is of utmost importance, right? And if you are one of the people who's taking it, who's benefiting, then you're like, well, why couldn't we? Like, of course we could, right? And it's like, oh, well,
Mhm.
no, you know what I mean? Like, if you're the one who is getting the benefit, then it seems like you would be more apt to say, oh, well, you get one and I get three, right? So I could see how that would. So economic strength growing, wealth distribution going down.
I think we agree that the situation is becoming more chaotic. It's not
Yep.
becoming less chaotic. in terms of technology influence and what that might do to wealth distribution, as you were talking, I thought to myself, okay, so maybe the technology is there's only one of a kind.
Yep.
It's not like a resource that could be evenly divided. It's not like striking oil where everybody gets a share, right?
Sure.
This is a thing where you have it, you don't. That's it.
Yep.
There's only the binary option there. And that because its availability is limited to one unit, whatever this thing is, it means that only the people who have the ability to interact with this unit, to control this unit, to hide or store this unit somewhere, they're going to be the ones who end up on the winning side of that wealth distribution as it continues to kind of spiral. And I would argue that those two things are going to be correlated. The government presence and the wealth distribution, I think, are going to be the two that are, well, that and the technology, right? Those three
Right.
things have to be linearly, directly correlated with one another in order for this to make sense. And then the economic strength, I'm kind of putting in air quotes and saying like the whole group benefits from the existence of this thing, but not
Right.
everybody is benefiting equally from its
Equally. Right.
existence and
Right. Right.
availability. So
Right.
I'm inclined to say that I think it would be interesting if they found some life form or some specific thing in the environment. I really like the idea of the environment being part of this. I
Hmm.
don't know if that is a sentient being. I don't know if it is a power source. That could be kind of interesting. I don't know if it is a, I don't
Could
know,
be an
what else would it be?
artifact. It could be a single artifact, right?
Artifact. Sure, it could be an artifact, which honestly reminds me a little bit of the game series Dead Space, where they find this big obelisk or this big sculpture that ends up being the thing that causes the necromorphs to exist. Like it's a vessel for distributing the undeadness of all of these creatures and whatnot. So that is sort of a one of a kind. You can't have multiple people, and that fits in neatly with the sort of alien cinematic universe
Yeah.
idea that the xenomorph itself is the technology, and they were going to
Right.
use it as
Right.
a bioweapon. So I kind of prefer that approach, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't object to it being a specific tool that was developed that does those same things.
No, I like that idea that that was something that maybe didn't show up on the scouting report, right? Like now that you're
Hmm.
here, it's one thing to like fly over or do a little field sampling, but it's a totally different thing when you're actually trying to set up a colony or setting up a community, and that becomes apparent right away, right? And then that's where
Hmm.
again that idea of like once you just start setting things up, it's like, oh well, this thing, whatever it is, would definitely benefit one. However you do the classes, it would definitely benefit one more than the other. And for as much lip service as people would want to give it, that we're going to distribute it evenly, it's like that's just not going to work. Like, how is that
Hmm.
actually going to work, right? So you think all of them are going up?
I could be persuaded either way on wealth distribution, but I
Hmm.
do think that if technology influence is going up, the government presence is probably also going to go
Yeah,
up. And
yeah,
then wealth or economic strength is going to go up just by virtue of the existence of this thing, which means I think wealth distribution is going to deteriorate to the point where there will be haves and have-nots.
yeah.
Now, whether
That's
that's going up or down, I don't feel strongly one way or the other. I
yeah.
can define that, but
I
which
would say down. I would say wealth distribution is going down. So the world is becoming less well distributed in terms of resources.
okay.
And it could just be one of those things too, where it's like a unintended consequence, and now what are you going to do about it, right? And then the people who
Hmm.
are benefiting could be like, I don't see the problem, right? And the people who are losing are like, no, there's a massive problem here, and we need to address it.
There's a corollary. I don't know if, or I'm not sure if you watched it, but the Stephen King It TV series they made, Welcome to Derry, has this
Hmm.
kind of vibe to it because Pennywise ends up being the technology in that case, and the U.S. military tries to take Pennywise as a creature to use as a weapon, right? Like
Right.
it's a pretty good old fashioned trope, but similar idea. Like it creates this instability because they're trying to take advantage of a natural force in the world that shouldn't be meddled with, and it's going to have all these negative ripple effects for everybody in the town. And that's kind of what I'm thinking about here, but I'm still trying to figure out which genre do we think would sit neatly on this, because I'm partial to not far future sci-fi. I think
Hmm.
it's overwrought. We can come up with something different or interesting there. And maybe it doesn't have to be people, right? Like we don't have to have human beings being our characters here.
Sure.
It could be some other fantasy or other, as you said, species versus race versus whatever, right? We
Hmm.
can kind of come up with a different format for this. But in general, whatever these sentient beings are that have discovered this technology, I do think the idea of them being lower tech implies to me that it's not a future society. It's
Yeah.
more something rooted in our actual history past, right? Like not
Yeah.
something that we would look at and say this is speculative about the long term from here.
Yeah, that's what I mean for me too. That what I would say that the keys would be they're isolated. This was an intentional committee or intentional community, right? This wasn't just something that happened to form. And then the technology, whatever we want to say that is, and I think we should probably land on that, is the disrupting force that now everybody needs to, like, you went out there with your playbook. And now the playbook no longer works, no matter what way you cut it, because of this new technology, right? Like we got to rewrite the playbook, but we don't have anybody to appeal to. We don't have anybody to go back to. You know what I mean? Like we've got to do it ourselves. And you could totally see how with a few hundred, people or up to 1,000 people, that's only, like the size of a high school, whatever, that people would very quickly be at each other's throats if they needed to decide what it was that they. So do you have any ideas about what the technology could be, and how it's related to the economic strength?
Maybe we crib a little bit from Vaesen here, and if we did go with sort of Nordic Gothic horror or something along those lines, it is an artifact, and maybe it's tied to some spirit that inhabits this world or some other thing that they're going to try to command to be their bodyguard, be
Okay.
their in service of pillaging the other societies in this world. Maybe they anticipate this could be a weapon or a tool toward that end, and that the natural force that functions within this artifact or is associated with this artifact ends up being the tool. And
Okay.
that's kind of what I'm thinking. Is I have a fondness for the sort of Tim Burton-y style
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
aesthetic, the Gothic Vaesen style aesthetic. I like the artwork associated with that, but
Yep.
I'm I
Why don't
could be
we?
persuaded one way or the other.
No, no, I like that. Why don't we? I mean, because I think we could do everything we just talked about, and then having that technology be some sort of not necessarily misunderstood, but not well understood
Mm.
something, right? And then it's like we ought not to be using this
Hmm.
for any like I could see too, like we don't have a very good military. Couldn't we use this in lieu of a military? And it's like we ought not to be doing this, right? So I could totally see. So you want to go for like a dark fantasy? I mean, that's my
Yeah,
genre.
dark. I think dark fantasy is a fun one. I mean, it could sit somewhere in between something like The Witcher and Vaesen, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And it doesn't have to be set. I'm not married to it being set in our world. Like, I think it's
Right,
totally
right.
fine that this is some alternate universe in which we have that sort of gothic style applied to everything that's happening. Which I don't know what I would call it, but I imagine there must be some kind of technological or I know obviously our technology was at a 2 and it's trending upward, but I'm thinking if this were set in the mid 19th century or something along those lines, the technology would probably be at best something steampunky, but in the
Yeah.
context of being more gothic horror. So
Right,
again,
right.
which I think is kind of how I envision Vaesen working, is that you have these tools that are probably outside the realm of what would actually have existed in that world, but are loosely technologically advanced enough that you can further the story without having to worry too much about was that thing invented by that date, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah. So what do you think it does? That's the last, I think, is we're coming up on an hour here, and I think that that's the last question that we would need to figure out is, so this is a group that is relatively small, it's isolated, they went out here for a specific reason, we probably should figure out what the specific reason is too, right? And then they come across this disrupting, however we want to call it, technology, and then that causes a dramatic kind of break in society in terms of we can no longer run things the way that we had planned on running things because there is this thing. So then the question is, what do you think the thing is?
I think I would lean toward they, as an adventuring party, as a scouting party, were sent here because they were supposed to retrieve something of monetary value.
Okay.
So in some sense, it's a little bit of the conquistador, Lewis and Clark, Manifest Destiny thing, not just about getting land, but about you need to go more like the gold rush, frankly, like that you're trying to find something that's going to have monetary value and that you bring it back and you could
Yeah.
distribute it evenly. If everybody came back, they would be successful and they would be able to make a living off of this. But it turns out the thing they found or the thing that was in the scouting report was not actually financially valuable. It was valuable in this other way, that it
Yeah,
had some
yeah.
function as opposed to some physical function as opposed to some other whatever the other value might have been, monetary value might have
Yeah.
been. So I do think the military influence being a 2 and the religious influence being a 1, religion isn't trending and military isn't trending, but I do think that those plus the low arts and culture could be that maybe this introduces the possibility of the formation of a cult
Hmm.
and or the occult, that this could be something like, not that it's quite the same, but the Ark of the Covenant or
Yeah.
the Holy Grail or whatever. Like it's a thing that represents another thing,
Yeah.
and its power is largely militaristic or could be used to create some kind of defensive matrix for the people who found it, whatever
Yeah,
that ends
yeah.
up being.
No, I like that because I mean, it makes me think too that like you would have a boom town where the boom town that is around the gold rush or something like that. That town wouldn't have much economic strength, and if you're out in the
Hmm.
middle of nowhere, your chunks of gold don't matter. Like that's not going to save you.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Like you can't eat it, you can't spend it, whatever.
Hmm.
It's got to be turned into something else. And that could be their whole goal is to go out there because the agriculture trade is for, right? So they're just supposed to be out there extracting. And then they find
Hmm.
something that says, well, maybe we can process it ourselves, right? Maybe we can do something like we can,
Hmm.
instead of having to have it shipped back to be refined, we can start refining it here and using it here.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that, and I like the idea of a boomtown a lot. The
Yeah,
boomtown with
boomtowns
the
are great.
Gothic aesthetic is pretty interesting
Yeah, that's
here,
great. I
and
love it.
I think because we're sticking with a pretty small community, I'm kind of imagining that to get to this place was like traveling the Oregon Trail. Like
Yeah,
this is not an
exactly.
easy place to get to. People died on the way to get there. Like people are not regularly traversing the terrain to get back and forth. I mean, maybe even a good comparison could be leaving the Shire and going all the way to Mordor, right?
Yeah, yeah,
If you get to Barad-dûr, you're probably not, worse for the wear, and I think that's going to be the case here.
yep,
Like
yep.
so
Tatters.
yeah, tatters. And so people are not leaving to go the other direction either. Even the people who think this is a terrible idea might be wary about getting back on the road to go back to where they came from because of the threats along the way.
Yeah,
So I really like that idea. I like the idea of maybe because the government, such as it exists, is going to be such a small number of people, or it's going to be sort of a hierarchy that is determined by who has control of this specific technology. Prior to that, this is another thing we were saying earlier, is like as a boomtown, this is going to be a small d democratic society where it's small enough that everybody really does get a vote because if you don't, then there's anarchy. Like it's
yeah,
going to be
yeah.
too small to be able to function as a society. So maybe we end up saying that the people who are running the mining operation, I don't know what exactly we want to utilize as the framework for how the thing was discovered,
Yeah.
but they would be the ones who ultimately end up benefiting from it and being the government such as it exists because they start making the rules once they have control of this thing.
Yep. Yeah, no, I like all that. I mean, it does really remind me of Deadwood, in which they I don't know if have you seen that?
I have not seen
Oh,
Deadwood,
it's
no.
so fantastic. But it's one of those things where everybody goes out there trying to be a rugged individualist. And it's like, oh,
Hmm.
well, we kind of need a place to go buy our supplies and we kind of need a place to go drink our whiskey, whatever it is. Like this
Hmm.
town grows up and they're like, oh, well, eventually you need to have a mayor and you need to have a
Hmm.
fire chief. Like they do it really reluctantly and kind of draw straws about you need to
Hmm.
have this kind of infrastructure. And I could sort of see that too, that if you left, with those positions being already determined
Hmm.
that would like wait a minute, we got to rethink about this, or we got to think about this again, like we got to rethink
Hmm.
this. Do we want to throw in lots and revote for whoever, right? And like if you're the mayor,
Hmm.
you don't want that. So let's nail down. I'm not opposed to mining. I'm not opposed to like any kind of harvesting. I like. I guess the question would be what would, and I mean we can also work this out too. Like oftentimes when I'm doing this with the three-part system where you build the world, build the characters, and then tell the story, it's through developing the characters that you start to flesh a little bit of this out too. So it's like
Hmm.
you don't want to make it so solid that there's no, create characters that can't really fit into this world. But already I can see lots of opportunities that if you are a reluctant member of this society, right? Like maybe you
Hmm.
don't love the fact that class is all equal and you think that you're superior, then you're seeing this as a real opportunity where somebody
Hmm.
else may be able to say, hey, this is an opportunity to raise everybody up, right? And that's
Hmm.
like we should be exploiting it. But do you have any strong sense as to what the resource could be and what the technology would be?
I'm kind of thinking it would be interesting if they found this in, say, a body of water, somewhere that's going to be difficult to access, and that if only certain people are able to access that area, it gives them more privilege over the thing that they discover. It could be that the force that's discovered has no physical presence. It could just be something that happens as a result and maybe is misattributed to this artifact.
Yeah, it could
So
be. Yeah.
that could be kind of interesting. Like that they discover this artifact, some weird stuff starts happening in this boom town, and they attribute it to the artifact, but it's all superstition. And that could
Right.
be end up maybe this is a situation that is actually the real bad guy is ourselves, right? Like
Yeah, yeah,
we're the
yeah. Of
ones who
course.
create
Of
the
course.
nightmare for ourselves based on greed or whatever.
Yeah.
Like maybe I'm building a metaphor there. I don't know. I don't really feel strong about anything, although I do kind of in my mind's eye have the image of an artifact, like some
Hmm.
specific object, like
Yeah.
either some small obelisk or a statue of some sort. And maybe it's a statue of some organism that they don't recognize, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's a statue from a lost civilization that had carved this animal or this creature, and they have no context for what that might actually be. And maybe we discover through the characters we develop that there's more information about this than was originally thought, and that
Yeah.
could further disrupt the sort of distribution of power and wealth in the society, or create another faction within it. That could be kind of interesting. Now I'm thinking a little bit about Fallout and the kinds of, the Brotherhood of Steel's entire thing is seeking out artifacts from the old
Yep.
world and then attributing value to them that didn't actually make any sense based on what
Right.
those objects were. Like if they
Right.
find an old tea kettle and they don't know what it was, then
Yeah.
maybe it becomes a new religious object or
Yeah.
something. So I do think the spiritual end of this gets a little tricky because the religion is so low. Like, I
Right.
don't know how to feel about that. Or would this be a largely secular society that then, I don't know. I'm trying, like, assigns natural world values to this artifact.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of it being either in a body of water or somehow other remote that you would need. So you would either need tools to get down inside the mountain, or you would need to get scuba gear or some kind of, gear to be able to get under the water surface enough, because then that would mean, well, we only have 10 sets. So that means only 10 people could ever go down there at any given time, right? And it's somebody's job to do that. And it's like, well, they're the ones who could pocket a little bit more or be in closer proximity and kind of see how things are
Mm.
sort of evolving. So I like that. And I also like the idea of just kind of keeping it open a little bit and maybe
I
just
was
kind of seeing if how the characters may lead us to one conclusion or the other. But I think right now this is already pretty rich.
I was gonna say, like, maybe it's a little too squishy, but I kind of like the idea that they don't know what they've
That's
found, right?
yeah, that's exactly I was going to say
That
that.
it's I'm imagining like a little rock cave on an island in the middle of this very big lake. That maybe the weather in this place is awful all the time. It's
Yeah,
raining and cloudy and dark and whatever, very spooky. And to get to the island is difficult, right? Like
yeah,
you've made this trek to get here. There's the boom town. It's kind of set itself up so it's functioning in a way that's sustainable. And then somebody makes this discovery, but they can't quite articulate what it is they found or what it does. But the rumor of it is enough to
yeah,
drive people's
yeah.
behavior or change their incentives in a way that destabilizes the society. And everyone starts speculating about what they could do with this thing without
Right.
actually knowing what it is. And then, like, if I were running this with my class and we were doing the role play or the simulation or whatever that would come after this, I would ask them to come up with, well, depending on what the nature of the course was, whether it was my interactive storytelling course or my complex systems course or whatever, or my instructional design course for that matter, I think that's when I would ask them to create their characters and tell me what do they
Yeah,
find,
yeah,
right? Like
exactly.
I want to
The
hear what you
MacGuffin,
think.
right?
Exactly. Like it's a MacGuffin. We've just created a MacGuffin in this
Yep.
cave on a lake in the middle of
Yeah, yeah, it's
nowhere.
great. That's great. No, I think that's perfect. I think that's really perfect because I think too what you were alluding to. I was just having this conversation in my world building class last week. Is they're starting a new world and they're like trying to decide. It wasn't this particular class. It was a couple years ago where they were saying, oh well, the aliens come to Earth and they're secretly spiriting off people and no one knows what they're doing with them. And I'm like, okay,
Hmm.
time out. Like that's totally fine. Do you know what they're doing with them, right? And it's like,
Hmm.
so there's a couple different things. You as the authors, you as the creators can know, and people in the world don't know. But it's also liberating to not, you don't even have to know, right? I mean, like
Hmm.
the aliens are inscrutable even to you as the creator, right? Like we have no idea why they're taking it, but some people think they're taking them off to, Nirvana, and other people think that they're eating them raw, right? And it's like that alone just puts differences of opinion at each other, right? And like, oh, well, why would one say one and why would one say the other? And it's like, oh, well, that's all the world building, right? Like, what would be the material that they would need to have, evidence that they would need to gather in order to make one case or the other. So it doesn't really matter which one is true, and you don't even
Hmm.
need to know it, right? That's one of the things, just real quick. So this is one of the things that I thought I watched the Alien prequels. They kind of drove me crazy because I'm like, oh, these are movies that are answering questions that absolutely nobody had.
Hmm.
It's like the aliens just being a crazy thing that exists, and it's like we don't need to go into why they were bioengineered, right? It's like that's no one ever was wondering where did they come from.
I do think that's a really important point, and we had talked about this previously with respect to, I had called it the sheep in the box, but the idea that just it's open-ended for interpretation intentionally. And
Yeah,
I do find that to be richer if you're trying to communicate an idea about character development and why people behave the way they do. Like it, to your point, the MacGuffin can just be a MacGuffin. It doesn't have to do anything. It doesn't have to be involved in the story beyond the fact that somebody thought it existed and that set off a chain of events. And really what we're interested in is not whether or not the thing really existed, but how did its potential existence affect people's thinking and behavior, which I think, especially if you're trying to interrogate the systems themselves, is much more valuable than just let's go and explain exactly where this thing came from and why and whatever, which I think is the trap that a lot of authors fall into, is that they then feel like they have to explain the thing, because if they don't, then somebody's going to raise a question about it and their answer is going to be, well, I don't know, I didn't really think of that, right? Which is the George R. R. Martin problem, or the J.K. Rowling problem, or the pick your favorite franchise. And this is the reason why a lot of people will say stop while you're ahead, like keep writing and writing and writing yourself into a corner, because the more open-ended it is, the less defined the world is, the more room there is to wiggle around and kind of come up with interesting interpretations. It's the reason why I really like the X-Files. I think it's one of the reasons why, for those of you who don't know, Vince Gilligan, the creator of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul and now Pluribus, he was a writer on the X-Files, and I went back and watched some of the episodes that he had written, and they're just genuinely interesting because he knows when to shut up and let the audience kind of fill in the gaps themselves, as opposed to assume that you need to go through and beat them over the head with whatever the specifics are of this situation that they've created. So.
Yeah, and that's, it's one of those things too that I always think, if you create this artifact, so we're talking about this artifact, we don't quite know what it is, and we'll come back to that next time. But if it turns out that it is like a shard of pure evil, right? That's what it is in its essence. Then the people who are for it are going to be necessarily bad, and the people who are against it are going to be necessarily good. And it's like, but how often do we ever have that kind of clarity that this thing is good or bad? Like, that only happens in stories. In life, we need to let things play out to see how they actually sort of wind up. And I think there's a lot of good energy, storytelling energy, that comes from an author's own uncertainty as to whether this might turn out good, or, is it the road to hell is laid with good intentions? You know what I mean? It could be something along those lines, and you don't need to, and maybe your mileage will vary depending on, as a person in this world, maybe your mileage varies.
I was about to say that as soon as you said that, the path to hell is paved with good intentions, maybe this artifact just makes people more who they are, right? Like that it just takes their personalities, their characteristics, and it just drives them to be more the person that they are at their core. And that's kind of an interesting thing to play around with. Like if you were already, so especially if you're starting in a society that was largely communistic or small d democratic, right? That all of these latent human characteristics are just there waiting to be exploited, not by any specific supernatural force, but just the potential for there to be one. And then you deciding that's how I'm going to throw off the yoke of this society and become the person I was meant to be, for good or bad.
It's social media.
Yeah, it's social media, right? Like there's a
that's what they find. They find social media on this
island. There's a huge potential in this. I really like that idea a lot.
Yeah, I think I do too. It reminds me of Stanislaw Lem's Solaris, where one of the things that I love about that book, I have not seen the movies, but what I love about the book is that they never really figure it out. It's like it's alien because they don't know what it's trying to say to them. They can't communicate to it. It's putting weird thoughts in their head, right? They're all kind of, am I going crazy? Is it meaning to do this? And the answer at the end is like, we don't know, right? I mean, like it was alien. That's what alien means. So I like that a lot. Because especially like if you are trying to be on your best behavior to get along in this intentional community, and then all of your most strong traits, and that doesn't even need to be negative. It could just be, I like to speak up a lot, or I, like whatever it is. And it's like, well, that's going to be really annoying if you just let that go, right? Especially when you're a million miles from nowhere. I love it.
I was going to say it. Not that we like to use the D&D alignment chart or whatever, but it is interesting to think about like what happens when you now have everyone who is trying to behave in this sort of social contract neutral way flying off to being chaotic good, chaotic evil, lawful evil, lawful good, chaotic neutral, whatever. Like they're just going to kind of be whoever, and like that kind of individual anarchy in a society that has been so deliberately organized in this particular way is really good. And I'd like to point out too, just as one final thought to go meta on this process, as you've been listening to this audience, those of you who are still tuned in, I'd point out like the numbers became irrelevant. Like we stopped talking about the numbers, right? So when we had previously said that the numbers are really only a scaffold to start the conversation, this is what we meant is they really don't matter at this point. It's more of that's an interesting idea. How could we massage this into that? And once you have sort of that framework set up where you've discussed your scope and sequence and breadth and depth and what kinds of genre conventions you want to add on, now you're starting to figure out, okay, where can we poke at the intersection between all these social forces to find the really interesting stuff that's human, the stuff that's not just the facts of the matter, but this is how people might start to think and behave in the psychology or sociology of this world. And I think that's the part that I really love the most, is watching how all of that unfolds, especially when you have a group of people who've created characters and then their characters come into conflict over these things.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, I think that's a hot spot to leave it.
Hot spot, is that what they
spot?
call it?
And then we're gonna create our characters next time. And now I'm excited. See, now
this is a good process. I like this 3-parter we've come up with. So next time we create our characters.
We should write a book on this. Oh
yeah, maybe we should. Maybe somebody should pay us to do that.
But don't bump. Donations welcome.
Yes. All right, so thank you all for listening. Thank you all for listening. And what were you gonna say?
I was gonna say thank you all for listening.
Oh well, double that, and we'll tune in. You'll tune in. We'll be here. You'll tune in next time for part 3 when we're chained to the it's like Plato's cave.
Right.
We're all chained to the bottom of it.
Or believing that your teachers live at school. That's the other one.
That does also feel pretty fitting. So thanks for tuning in, and we will talk to you next time for our character creation.
All right. Bye-bye.
See y'all later.
The Worldbuilding Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.